Everybody to today's webinar, How Much is a River Worth? Understanding the Economic Impact of the Huron River and Water Trail. Thank you all for making time today, this close to the holiday schedule, to listen to this exciting project of the Watershed Council. And yeah, just to give you a quick guidance before we go ahead and get started, and I see people are still filing into the room, so just to let you know that today's session is being recorded, and you will be receiving the link to that recording within about 24 hours. You'll get an email from the GoToWebinar platform, so you can disseminate that to others in your organization that maybe weren't able to join us here today. So just to kind of walk you through some basics of this platform, GoToWebinar, if you see that white arrow that my cursor is sitting on in the orange box, you can open that up and it'll open a number of panels. So I want to bring your attention to this questions and chat panel that you will see. We will use that to capture all of your questions. So please go ahead and type questions throughout the presentations themselves. Our presenters are going to be taking a minute pausing through their presentation to give us a chance to address those questions. So make use of that. The other panel that isn't captured in this screenshot, but you should be able to see it, is a handout panel. And so we have uploaded two handouts. One is a PDF of today's slide presentation. So you have that available. You can open it up in a separate window at any time during the webinar. And also the summary of the study, the economic impact study that we're going to be discussing here today. So take a look at those. So just a real quick introduction. My name is Deanna Toledo. I am the Leadership Development Director for River Network. And so if you're new to River Network, we are about a 30-year-old organization. Our birthday is coming up. And over those 30 years, we've filled a unique niche within the environmental community by focusing primarily on the more than 2,000 river and watershed organizations that are working across the country at the local and the state level, trying to engage a broad community to support healthy rivers and water resources. So part of what we do is within our Strong Champions initiative is to help build the capacity of those local entities to do their work more effectively. And so today we see the study that we're going to be highlighting as a very effective conservation tool. Hopefully you'll agree with me after today's session, so that if you're interested in doing similar work, we're presenting some good, good case studies of somebody who's doing this economic analysis on the ground. So just really briefly, we are a membership organization and we just are doing a soft launch. In fact, I think today is the very first time we're even talking about it publicly, but we've revamped our membership program. And so now we have various free and dues paying membership categories. So I just encourage you to check those out, and you have that in our Join Our Network link in our website. You can learn more about that. So please, if you're not already joined, there is a free membership option. You can access other trainings and hear about other opportunities like today's. So I want to turn to the National Park Service Rivers and Trails and Conservation Assistance Program, who is today's sponsor. What you have in front of you is a photo of our first ever gathering of all the National Water Trails managers that took place and was hosted by one of our webinar presenters in Ann Arbor last year. The Huron River Water Trail is a national water trail. And so, it is part of the mission of this program to encourage best practices for water trail management. So thank you to the Park Service. So I'm just going to turn it quickly. We are turning our attention to southern Michigan, the Huron River, and to the recent study that was just completed on the economic impact. And today, to have us share their project and their work with us, we have our two excellent speakers. Very excited to have them join us. So we've got Elizabeth Rigg. I'll introduce them briefly and then turn the control over to them. As the Deputy Director of the Huron River Watershed Council, Elizabeth plays a number of various roles in strategic planning and program development, and also manages the River Up program, which is a private-public revitalization initiative of the river that's focusing on a number of different projects to improve the ecology, to strengthen recreation opportunities and placemaking on the river. She's also the facilitator and manager for the Huron River Water Trail, and led the effort to have it designated back in 2015 as the 18th National Water Trail by the Park Service. She has a Master's of Science from University of Michigan School of Environment, and a BA from Lawrence University, and serves on a number of boards locally. So welcome to Elizabeth, and joining Elizabeth is Dr. Paul Isley, who has served as the Associate Dean of the Seidman College of Business in Grand Valley State University for the last 2 years, following 6 years of service as the chair of the Economics Department. He has a PhD in economics from Purdue University, a master's in economics also from Purdue, and other degrees from University of Wisconsin-Madison, my own alma mater. So Dr. Isley teaches a variety of courses. His expertise is environmental economics, looking at sustainable, efficient use of resources, teaches courses in business cycles and growth, and other initiatives. His research has explored West Michigan's economy in particular across a number of factors, including a number of natural resource factors like evaluating wind power along the Lake Michigan lakeshore, valuing the environmental cleanup of Muskegon Lake, and now with this project, valuing the economic impact of the Huron River. So we are very pleased to have Dr. Isley and Elizabeth, and let me just quickly then turn it over to both of you to lead us through today's presentation. So with that, Elizabeth, you want to take control?
Sure. Thanks, Deanna. Okay, let me know if we're all set.
Yes.
Okay, good. Thanks so much for the introduction. Thanks to you and to River Network for hosting this webinar today so that Paul and I can talk with other trail managers and people involved in river and water conservation or recreation. So good afternoon, this is Elizabeth Riggs, and tell you just real briefly about my organization before I turn it over to Paul. The Huron River Watershed Council is a nonprofit. We are a little more than 50 years old, and we work to protect and restore the river for healthy and vibrant communities in southeastern Michigan. I like to think of us as kind of like the Switzerland of environmental work. We kind of bridge political boundaries by building partnerships among the communities, residents, and business sector. We have more than 1,000 members, about 600 volunteers, and a staff of 13 professionals that are scientists, planners, marketers, and volunteer professionals. Our programs focus on watershed science and management and education and stewardship. We're probably best known for our field monitoring programs, our public education and outreach, land use planning and protection, and also the Huron River Water Trail. So today we are actually unveiling a fully refreshed website. So if you want to learn more about us, you can go to our website. And then I am going to, Paul, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Grand Valley.
Excellent. So Grand Valley is a public state university, a regional comprehensive university in Michigan, in the southwest side of the state. We're a large master's university. We have over 25,000 students, and I'm in the business college. So we're accredited at the highest levels, and we have about 3,000 students. We also work a lot with the rest of the university. We really have a liberal arts focus here at Grand Valley. So being in the business school, I also spend a lot of time working with natural resource management people, biology people, and researchers at the Annis Water Resources Institute. So you can kick off the start there, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Paul. Hey, before we get into the next slide, Deanna, I think we have a couple of poll questions that we wanted to share with the participants today. Now that we've shared a bit about who Paul and I are, we'd like to get a feel for who's on our webinar today. So I believe the attendees will be.
Yeah, they are filling it out as we're speaking. So
So quick.
give it a couple more seconds and then I'll close the poll and everybody can see their responses. So just give it a couple more seconds if you would please select where you fit in across these 5 little boxes we've created. Okay, closing it in 2, 1. Okay. Can everybody see the results?
Yep.
Great. So we have about a small sliver of executive directors and a whole lot of program coordinators and senior program staff. Thank you. Elizabeth, do you want me to launch the second poll?
Sure. Yes, please.
Okay. Okay, just 1 second. Ooh. Ryan, if you would launch the poll, please. I just had a momentary problem here. Okay. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to give it a couple more seconds. There's about a quarter of you that are still responding. They're coming in quickly. Okay, I'm going to close it in 2, 1. All right. Great mix. There's as you can see, about 40% environmental nonprofit and a healthy showing of local state government and federal government and some university. So great. Thank you.
Good. Thank you so much. All right. We'll have a couple more questions later in the presentation. So here is where Paul and I are going to be taking you over the next several minutes during the webinar. A little bit of background before we describe the economic impact study specifically and the key findings, as well as some really good, I think, meaty information about how we got the study going and underway, and then how we're using it. There's a world premiere of a mini documentary that we're going to be sharing with you, and then Q&A at the end, and also we'll set aside some time during the webinar for your questions. But that is the journey we plan to take you on. So to help us get oriented in southeastern Michigan, where we did the study, the Huron River is located in the Lake Erie Basin of the Great Lakes. It flows for around 120 miles through parts of 7 counties. We have a lot of small units of government, about 63, and we have around 650,000 people living in the watershed. The watershed covers about 900 square miles. So there's quite a bit of human activity in this watershed, but we also have quite a bit of protected area, parkland, as well as about a third of the river has special protections from development. Excuse me. Through our state's Natural River Program. So we have a lot of state and federal protected species. We have a catch and release smallmouth bass fishery that's also known nationally. And then I would say the main challenges to the river's health are stormwater runoff, dams, climate extremes, development, and contamination from bacteria. Excuse me. The Watershed Council leads this River Up public-private partnership that was mentioned in the introductions. And really the goal of that is to have a renaissance, a revitalization of the river. We focus on three areas: investing in river recreation to improve quality and access, improving river health, and transforming the river corridor by trying to literally and figuratively turn our river towns to face the river and also to connect to each other. Our ultimate goal is to transform the river corridor into this premier destination in Michigan and the Great Lakes. So since 2012, we've invested about $2.5 million in this work, and we've been able to leverage another $40 million from partner investments. The water trail is one of our main projects for River Up. So the Watershed Council facilitates the trail, but it's a consortium of several dozen interested groups and communities. And we've been busy making a number of improvements over the past few years. So the yellow stars that you see are where we've done improvements around dams to improve portages for paddlers. So these have either been completed or are underway. The purple stars that you are seeing are our trail access improvement projects. So where we've either created or improved launches and landings. Oftentimes the projects are led by us, but some of them are led by our trail partners. And then the turquoise diamonds are river and riparian habitat improvement projects. So in addition to these, we've also been working to place more than 100 wayfinding signs at access sites. And then, of course, we've been supporting the 5 largest towns on the river to help them become trail towns. So many of you are probably familiar with this concept of trail towns. We are applying this concept that was originated for land-based trails in the Great Allegheny Passage. And we're trying to adapt that, or we are adapting that to water trails to leverage trail-based tourism and recreation for community and economic development in our trailside communities. So the towns have developed several of the components that are needed to be full-fledged trail destinations. For example, to provide a gateway moment, we've installed now 4-sided stone kiosks at trailheads, like what you see in the picture on the left. We've also been working with our local teams to create a sense of place, doing heritage interpretation tie-ins, looking to provide trail continuity among the towns through signage and marketing materials, and so on. So there's been quite a bit of work in these communities over the past few years. And it was those trail towns that also helped us decide where to start collecting the data for our study with Grand Valley State. So how did this study come about? In 2013, my organization requested an economic impact analysis of the water trail from our home county, Washtenaw County. Their analysis was really helpful. It was released in December 2013, and it focused on the water trail just in that county. And it didn't collect new data. It used readily available data in resources. So in 2013, 2014, when we started sharing this study or this analysis with our partners, we immediately knew that we wanted a more robust study that covered the whole river, the whole water trail, to have a good baseline so that we could measure change in trail use and return on investment. And then when we had I think it was 2015 actually that we had that first meeting of the National Water Trails here in Ann Arbor, when we were together and we found out that the National Park Service did a survey of impact studies for water trails, and they found just a few, we realized that there would be interest around the country in a more robust economic impact study. So Paul and I want to share with you the timeline for our work together on this study. I already mentioned we started with River Up in 2012, and I just mentioned about the first economic study that was done. And then in 2014, 2015, I started looking for who would be good partners for us on a more extensive study. So I was looking for funders who might be interested, and also pursued the University of Michigan since they are located just a few miles from our office. And we didn't really get a whole lot of traction initially. And then in 2016, um, it was suggested by our funder that we take a look at Grand Valley State University. And that's really when things took off. So, it's a lot happened. Everything from developing our scope of work, our timeline, and our budget, um, securing funding for us to be able to contract with Grand Valley and complete our agreements, and kind of work through everything from what's our scope to crunching the data and writing the reports happened in pretty quick succession. Now, Paul, did you want to say anything more about this?
Well, I mean, this was a quite a busy time frame to get this all done. I think we'll talk a little bit later about some of these timeline issues, but it was really important to align these all to deal with the summer survey time.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and then the last bit here in our timeline is bringing us kind of up to current date, where we were developing a summary that was shorter and more visual for the general public to accompany Grand Valley's report. And then we have been working on our rollout of this, and we'll continue to do that for several months. Before I turn this over to Paul for the next chunk of slides, we wanted to share with you information about costs to do the study. The costs that are listed here for the Watershed Council is really soup to nuts for this project. The staff time for the project included some of my time, as well as time from our marketing staff and our volunteer and stewardship coordinator. So we had project management and admin. We do have extensive reserve of volunteers to draw from, but this was a really special new kind of volunteer activity for them. So trying to find people who are interested in doing that. Of course, working with our donors and providing any needed support on the survey period, and then report preparation and rollout. So we raised $25,000 from a small family foundation in order to hire Grand Valley. But then in terms of our all-in costs for all of these tasks, it was probably around 45, maybe even as high as 50,000 to do the work. Okay, Paul.
Okay, so we can look at how Grand Valley dealt with that 25,000 side. And with that, we had researcher expenses, and that really came down to the amount of time that we needed to use PhD level specialists to handle some of the calculations and modeling that was necessary to get to the answers. We then also had some project management on this side, particularly as we coordinated with HRWC, and we dealt with the survey teams because they were stretched out over a long distance. Because Grand Valley is 2 hours away from the Huron River watershed, we had travel costs that were involved. And then we had to bring in some data and some multipliers and some supplies on average. And then whenever you're going to work with an entity like a university, there's going to be overhead costs that are included to keep things moving forward. So I think that got us through the costs. I think we were going to ask if there are any questions before we got into some of the more technical components of the analysis.
I'm not seeing any questions yet, but would encourage everybody to go ahead and use that questions box to submit those. So I think you're good to keep going, Paul.
Excellent. So we really did three types of analysis on this particular watershed, and it was really focused around the things that were being affected by the river towns and the trail. So as a result, we really focused a lot on recreation value. We focused on property values and aesthetics and amenities. And then we did some more ecosystem services at the end. So we'll start with the recreation value, which is the biggest chunk of value that we have along the stretch of river. In order to do this, we need to do a bunch of surveys. Those surveys required us to stretch people out all along the river at the various trail towns. And then we needed to do an additional survey that looked at people who weren't using the river, so we could determine what percentage of the people in the area used the river. Doing that, we were able to come up with the spending by those visitors, and it came up just short of $30 million in direct spending by visitors. We always like to give a direct spending number. That's the number that's most believable to local policy people and local politicians and developers. That number is all completely believed, and they're going to go with that. So we like it. It's a very solid number. We then also applied multipliers to that so that we could compare it to other types of development projects that were going on. And we found an additional $23.6 million in indirect and induced spending. So spending that results either indirectly from the spending by people on the river or by spending by the businesses they spent at. So the fact that they rented a canoe allowed the workers at the livery to then also get haircuts. One of the important things that we were able to do with these two sets of surveys was determine the number of visitor days, and that gave us 2.6 million visitor days along the river, which was a substantial number. That gave us 53.5 million in annual economic output and 641 local jobs. Those are numbers that local politicians love to deal with. That's a little bit different than the ecosystem services value of recreation. Under those conditions, we would look at the entire consumer value as opposed to what they spent. And in this particular case, because of how the surveys were done and some of the challenges we had with some of the visitors in order to get a good random sample, we ended up using benefit transfer here, which I'll go over more deeply later. But the consumer value was almost double what their spending was. So they were getting a good value out of coming and working on the river. So let's go on to the next one. Also, because we were surveying, we were able to ask other questions. And so we'll note that we were able to talk about how often visitors came. We were able to talk about were they satisfied. And 57% of the users had the very highest level of satisfaction, but more than 90% were at least satisfied with their experience along the river. And we also asked income. That's an important piece in order to start looking at that consumer value. It's something that we always like to ask, and people hate to answer. So it's always at the end of a survey, and it's always very voluntary. But we were looking at incomes between $25,000 and $85,000. So these were every place from students to professionals. All right, so let's move to the valuation of the properties. So we did hedonic valuation along the river. So we had to have sales numbers and information on the properties along the length of the river. Two of the counties were very helpful for us and let us use a very large amount of data. In order to do this well, you can have two properties that are on a river that are very different, as you can see in the picture. We have to control for those differences in the property as along with the concept that they're near the river. So you need characteristics about the houses, you need characteristics about the neighborhood, and then you need to bring in the environmental characteristics. And you have to do a lot of high-end testing to make sure that it isn't just big houses that are near the river, because then we have statistical problems in doing this. So that requires somebody with a good amount of sophistication. But the results that we found were impressive. We were able to see a 39% increase in value for houses in Oakland County that were on or near the river, and 65% increase in the value of a property on or near the river in Wayne County. And as we extrapolated that across all properties in the watershed, we came up with almost $630 million in value added to the properties along those rivers. So then we had some things that we had to fill in that we didn't get primary data on, and here we used benefit transfer, and we did that for the consumer value of recreation. We did it for biological diversity. We did it for wetland flood reduction and a few other things. So here you can see that we grabbed recreation values from Muskegon, and we grabbed biodiversity numbers from Saginaw Bay. And we did that because these were decent surveys, these were decent studies that were nearby. And the closer you can bring a transfer to your location, the better it is. Unfortunately, a lot of these types of studies are done along the coasts, and we find that the error in those values transferring them to the Midwest is very, very high. So once we added all of this together, we came up with some relatively strong economic values. So the first column is the annual economic impact. So this is the stuff that is monetized, the actual value in dollars that's being spent, or the additional value in properties as a result of proximity to the river. And we can see that the total there is $78.6 million in addition financial and economic value to the region. This is very important to be able to talk about to developers and policymakers and that type of people to help visualize it. Then it's also useful to put that number in context. So since U of M is right on the river, we compared it to the home football season for the University of Michigan. And this number here is approximately the same as the entire home season for the Michigan football team. So it's a relatively very strong number that really adds a lot of value to the region. Then we also look at the environmental values, and those, we bring in all of that additional stuff beyond what people spend and some of the ecosystem services values that are comparable. And there you can see the annual environmental value is almost double what we see in the economic impact. And then we can look at the long run and see that the total value is close to $4 billion. So in doing all this, we had to think about, what do you need in order to do these studies? You need team members. So you certainly need modelers. You're going to get those out of economics or ag economics, or there can even be property consultants, those sorts of things. You need GIS specialists. All of this money has to be tied, all of this activity has to be tied to where the river is. So we need to have the ability to do that. You need survey takers, and you need people with local knowledge so that you can put this all into context. And then you have to get data. We'll talk about some of the data later, and environmental data. And then you have to remember that there's regulations about how you can take surveys, and you have to get permissions for that. And there's regulations on in review boards, so we have to get approvals there. So let's look at some of the issues that we had quick. So surveys, here's the front page to our survey. There was a couple more pages that had demographics and some other information about how they were using the river. So this was necessary for us to start to understand how far people were coming, how much they were spending, and breaking it up into different components so that we could then apply the multipliers. So that's a pretty robust process in order to get this. We needed several hundred surveys in order to do this well. In order to do that, you had to have a lot of upfront logistics. You had to beta test these surveys on the local populations to see if they get it. You need to make sure you have randomness in the surveys. You have to make sure you have the right number. And then you have to remember that you don't want to overdo it because surveys cost somewhere between $1 and $5 per survey, depending on how you do the process. We want to remind you it's going to take longer than you think. You need to engage in this process 3 to 6 months before the surveys actually begin. So if we look at another set of issues that we had with the surveys, it was really centered around training. So we spent a lot of time training because in this case we used volunteers. We had to train them about the basics of random studies. We had to equip them to talk to people. We did a lot of role playing so that these people got used to asking the questions without leading the answers. And then we had to really schedule the nuts and bolts. In fact, during this training, we had several volunteers back out because they're like, this isn't what I'm used to volunteering with. And so it was really important for them to understand what they were going to be doing. You have to evaluate those teams. Are they the right teams to ask the questions? Are they going to cause biases? We've had cases where we've had young women interviewing middle-aged men, and for some reason we end up with really high income numbers. So you need to be careful about how those interactions happen. And so then you have to think about the play-off between volunteers, employees, and professionals. So the volunteers were able to do this work, but at one point we were behind on doing our efforts. We applied about 4 hours using employees and professionals, and we got about 10 times the number of surveys in that time frame than we did from the volunteers. So let's look at the next step. So a couple other things. Housing data used to be easy to get. It's now hard to get because all those housing entities have determined that it's worth money. They can sell it to Zillow. So it's really important that you have local people who can go and talk to the offices and convince them to give us your data. So I think that's near the end for me. And moving on back to you, Elizabeth.
Great, great. I'll just add a few more points from the perspective of the Watershed Council and how it was to have a nonprofit and the university work together on this project. So from my perspective, Paul's team and mine worked well for this project. It was a good fit. Grand Valley brought the mix of talent that we were looking for since we had questions about ecosystem value as well as economics. So they had the right people to do that on their team, and then they also had previous research, especially from other parts of Michigan and the Great Lakes that could be brought to bear on the work in this watershed. Also, there was a lot of back and forth over the course of our work. Grand Valley's project manager, Julie, was very responsive on everything from the emails to providing what our volunteers needed for training and materials. It wasn't the case that the Watershed Council met with the university team up front and said, yes, we want that from you. And then, we didn't get together until the end. It was a regular back and forth, especially during the survey period. So we were actively involved in many aspects. Since we were the local partner, we had the existing relationships with volunteers and the community partners. As Paul mentioned earlier, probably the most notable challenge was attracting the volunteers for the survey, in particular for survey times that were difficult to fill. It was a random sample, which meant that people were out 7 days a week from about 6:30 in the morning until, about 9 at night. The picture on the slide is the Sunday 6:30 a.m. shift that I took. Excuse me, getting over a cold. And then the other challenge was travel from our offices to our survey sites because some of those were nearly 1 hour away. And then also the travel consideration between Grand Valley and the Watershed Council. Okay. If my voice holds out, I want to share with you how we are using this information. The economic impact study is valuable. It's vital to the work that we're doing on the river. We want this information to be able to help us with targeted investments and prioritizing projects, and as a tool to engage new partners. So we have three main points we're using to communicate to our audiences, and I will let you read those. And then really our overall goal is to be able to show that these economic benefits are real and they're substantial, and to use that information to foster investment in protection and restoration of the river. And then we really are looking to help motivate people to act. So our general call to action is that we really want people to invest in river protection and restoration. And we're focusing on those three audiences: our local decision makers and leaders, business owners, especially in our trail towns, and then also residents. And kind of looking specifically at what are those calls to action for those different groups. This information we are finding already is very useful in helping us develop grant applications and make funding requests for the work that we're doing on the water trail. It also is helping us understand more about the demographics, that social part of it that Grand Valley was able to collect, and that you'll see in the appendices of their study, so that we now know which activities are particularly popular in which communities, and so we can look to try to help meet those needs, and to invest in the right kind of infrastructure. This also helps us to look at what business opportunities there are, either expansion or new businesses. It helps us in Michigan with trying to make the case that we do need a state program, because there's significant benefits that can be reaped by having water trails that are adequately maintained and promoted and have ongoing funding. And then, of course, to protect in policies and programs that protect the resource. That's the foundation on which this recreation is based. Sorry, I think, we thought that this was a good place for Deanna to help us with posting the next two poll questions.
Great. And so while we do that, Elizabeth and Paul, if I may turn our attention to a couple of questions that are coming in while people fill out that poll, which is how would you anticipate, what do you anticipate are the three biggest drivers on your own river or coastline? What are the economic drivers that you think are the biggest? So question is, how is a visitor day measured? Can you define that term? I think, Paul, you talked about visitor days.
Okay, so a visitor day is a specific term that we use. In most of the rest of the world, if you're going to talk to a tourism management person, they would just call it visits. So we make a distinction between an individual and how long they stay, and the number of visitor days. So if one person came and stayed for 5 days, that's 5 visitor days. Or if one visitor came on 5 different days, that's 5 visitor days. But that's still only one visitor. So we make the distinction between those two. This is where economists and tourism people get a little bit different. We've discovered in the last year and a half that the tourism people will take a visitor day and just call it number of visitors.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you, Paul. There's a lot of other questions coming in. Let's go ahead and close the poll here. Ryan, so what are the biggest, I should have said the biggest economic driver? So you see a large percentage anticipate that it would be recreation, about a fifth of respondents tourism, and about a third housing or development. Okay. Ryan, you want to go ahead and set off the second poll then, or the last poll? So if you are considering doing a study such as this, who are your target audiences that you're trying to influence by collecting and disseminating this sort of economic benefit information? Go ahead and fill that out. Maybe I can pose another question that's come in while people are filling out the poll. Are the dollar amounts that you're quoting annual benefits or total one-time benefits?
We gave both. So the 74 million is annual spending. The 150 million is annual environmental benefit of these ecosystem services. And the 3.8 billion is total.
Great. Okay, thank you. We still have a few folks to answer the poll, so let me ask another question while we leave that open. So again, what was the total cost, I think, Meredith is asked, what is the total cost of preparing this economic driver report, including cash and in-kind donations? I know you outlined at the beginning, was it 50,000 for total soup to nut cost, Elizabeth?
Yeah, that's the estimate that I would have, and that you could add to that the value of the volunteer time to do the surveys.
Mm. And you have not calculated what that would amount to in terms of in-kind donation, correct?
We've got that information, but I'd have to calculate one number for you.
Great. Okay, thanks. Let's go ahead and close this poll. So as people think about doing this kind of work, local decision makers are the primary audience for this kind of economic benefit, but also donors and grantors, as well as a couple of other categories. So let's close the poll. Thank you, Ryan. Just Elizabeth and Paul know that there are other questions, so just tell me when you want to pause and we can keep working through those.
Okay. Well, I think we just have a few more slides and a video, and we are at about 10 to the hour. So, okay. Just to wrap up this a little bit about how we're using it. One of the things that we had requested from the Grand Valley team when they were preparing the report is what would they recommend to us as far as the next time to embark on another study of this magnitude. So the recommendation was in about 5 to 7 years, because we would like to do several of these over time to see what kinds of changes there are. But in the meanwhile, they also suggested that we can develop an ongoing method to sample people out on the river, and that's something that we'd like to start doing in this next year. So the challenge will, one of the tasks will be to identify funding that will allow us to do additional studies like this. And I think, too, we recognize that we would like to expand the surveying points beyond the 5 or 6 sites. It's a 104-mile long river, and we were able to intercept people just at a limited number of locations, and it'd be great to be able to add to that. Okay, so that takes us through A through E, and I'd like to share with you this new mini documentary. You guys are the first audience to see this, but an important method for the Watershed Council to reach our followers and the general public about River Up is creation of mini video documentaries that tell the different facets of River Up through personal stories. So today, you're going to be seeing our premiere of this latest one that's titled The Blue Economy of the Huron River. And we developed this to help spread the main points about the economic impact study to a broader audience. So let me launch the YouTube link.
While we wait on that, can you quickly, Paul, say how large was the polling sample size?
Well, we had different samples. So I think the final group that was used in the economic impact was close to 250.
Great, thank you. Back to you, Elizabeth.
Okay, we ready?
Yep. I don't think we're hearing the sound of the video.
Ah. You're not, huh?
Nope. If you'd like, we can share this link with everybody following today's session.
Okay.
But is there anything like maybe a particular visual that you want to take us to using the bar at the bottom, or?
Sure. One of the things that we do is highlight stories in our trail towns, and to get close to the end here. So we make a point of highlighting different local businesses, our municipal canoe liveries, as well as some of the brew pubs and outfitters that are located all along the river. So it's really nice that it gives a more of a personal, uh, local flavor to it.
Great. All right. Thank you. We've got a few minutes here before the top of the hour. Is that it for your slides, Elizabeth?
That is
Otherwise,
it for our slides.
Great. Let me go ahead and turn to some of these questions that have come in. One was on multipliers. A project expense was multipliers. What is this and what does it cost?
So a multiplier is something that tells us how a dollar bounces around the location. So if I spend $1 on food, how does that result in them paying their suppliers, and how does that increase the value in the region? So in this particular case, we used RIMS multipliers from the US government, and those cost $255 for a given region. So you can define your region and spend that. There are more expensive modeling programs that allow more dynamic modeling than what we did here, but they go up in price. So the next most common modeling system like this would be REMI, and there you'd be talking thousands of dollars instead of hundreds of dollars.
Okay, great. A question for Elizabeth: is the Huron River impaired for any pollutants?
We do have a few TMDLs, one for phosphorus and for E. coli.
Okay. Another question is the only calculated value directly related to the water trail related to recreation value, or is there any value that is just water trail only? So does that make sense?
Yep. So obviously the recreation is where we started to look at for this, but the other side of that was that we also within the study have a business survey. So we didn't cover that here because of time, but we do go through and talk about the location of businesses and how they chose because of the water trail.
Great. Are there unique features to the Huron River or the trail towns that might have increased the value compared to other rivers in Michigan? Is there anything also that might have reduced the value or the use?
Well, I'll answer the first part and see if Elizabeth has something else. Mm-hmm. The aesthetic amenity value is highly influenced by the amount of development along the river. So this particular river has several of the counties that are highly developed, so there are lots of housing and therefore lots of additional housing value. But when you're on the river, it's very natural. So the type of use was very much paddling, and so but it didn't have any specialized fishing. So it's not like a cold water trout stream. So that would result in differences depending on those types of recreation.
Elizabeth, anything to add to that?
I think Paul characterizes it pretty well. The river uses in the corridor are variable in terms of housing stock and just and density. Uh, but we do, I think, a unique feature about this river is that there is it's a fairly consistent parkland along much of it.
Mm, okay. Let me ask Elizabeth if you might use the chat box to put in the link for everybody to see. There's some requests for the link to that video. And then I think we have maybe time for one last question, and that might be from Remy Long. What do you mean by total environmental benefit? Is that across some specific time span? What does total represent?
So total is a present value of a 30-year time frame, which is a time frame that's pretty consistently used within infrastructure cost-benefit analysis. So we chose that one. And so over a 30-year time frame, that would be the value generated by the systems that we looked at, and we did not look at all of them. So there's value that we left on the table because they were either too hard to calculate or wouldn't be as influential on the target communities that Elizabeth was trying to do.
Great. Okay. Well, I am including, I want to just take a minute to thank Dr. Paul Isley and Elizabeth Riggs. We are out of time. There's a few more questions that we didn't get to. So I want to encourage, if they're burning questions for you, to please reach out to them. Their emails are included in here. I also want to, again, before we close the webinar room, encourage you to open up the handouts tab, where you can pull out a summary of the report and copy of today's slides. The full report is included in this link that you see on top of your slide here. And so that's where you can get maybe some of the forms, survey forms, some of the additional information that that is in there. You can see in the chat box or in the questions chat box, Elizabeth has uploaded that link. We'll go ahead and include it alongside the link to the recording for today's session in the email that you will receive directly from the GoToWebinar platform. So again, thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Paul. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We will also, we just ask if you might take a couple of minutes as you get that email. Another link you'll find in there is a link to a brief survey, just to give us some feedback on this session and how we might improve future webinars. So I'm seeing a lot of notes from folks just thanking both of you as presenters, Paul and Elizabeth. So appreciate it. I think this was well-received information. And again, in that handout with the slides, you'll see their email addresses if you want to contact both Paul and Elizabeth directly. Anything else you want to say to just before we close up the room, Paul or Elizabeth?
No, thank you. It's been a wonderful experience.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays. Have a great rest of your day and rest of your year. Thanks, everybody.